Greetings, fellow ukuleleans. Jeff Weinberger coming at you here with a new ukulele tutorial. I'd like to continue our journey into blues. We were talking about essential chord progressions, and this is still part of that series, but I promised to do a part 2 of blues, and we might even do a part 3 because there's so much to blues, but let's get right into it here. What I just played was a 12-bar blues in C, but it was a little bit fancier than the one that we had done before. I gave you a very simple blues in the previous video. Today I'd like to talk about how to embellish it and how to enhance it so that it has a little more variation to it and isn't the same thing over and over. So one of the things you can do is do the 1 chord, the C chord or the C7 or both, as I was doing, for your first measure for bar 1 of 12. C or maybe C7, or like I like to do both. And then we would go to F7 right away in the second measure. That is a quick change. That's known as a quick change, where you're not sitting on 1 chord for a long time, but you're always moving. So second measure is a new chord. It's F7. And then we sit on C or C7 for 2 measures, although there's a million other things you could do there. We'll talk about that in a minute when we talk about how jazz players might approach a blues, how to make it jazzier. But for now, let's just sit on C7 for 2 measures. So our first 4 bars are C7, F7, C7, C7. Or if you don't want 7 chords, you could use major chords for a more simple, more folky or gospel-y kind of blues. But I'm going to use 7th chords. Here we go. That would lead us to the 4 chord, like most blues would. And in this case, we can do the 4 chord for 2 measures. Back to the 1 chord for 2 measures. The 5 chord, 4 chord, 1 chord, and the 5 chord. And as we discussed before, you can throw a turnaround there if you want to in the last 2 bars. Or so many turnarounds. And I did make a link in my previous video from last week to my tutorial on turnarounds in the key of C. So you can refer to that link if you want to get to those. So that's a fairly quick change blues. You got to keep moving with your chords. It's not too hard to play, but let's try it together. Let's get a little practice just in case that went by too quickly for you and you weren't sure of all of it. So again, it's the 1 chord, the 4 chord, back to the 1. Here comes the 4 chord, back to the 1, 5 chord, 4 chord, 1 chord, and finally the 5 chord. So that's a real standard way to do a quick change blues. Alright, let's try it together 2 times around the 12-bar form without me saying anything, except 1, 2, 3, 4. there you have a fairly simple but more complex than before blues, and that was the quick change blues. That's what most musicians call it, a quick change. And then you can make it even more complex by adding some jazz chords. There actually isn't really such thing as a jazz chord. Chords are chords. They can be used in any genre of music. But when we talk about jazz chords, we're kind of referring to this concept of having chords that have sevenths in them, ninths, 13ths, and also that they change more rapidly. There's more harmonic rhythm going on, a faster harmonic rhythm, which is just a fancy way of saying how quick the chords change. So we get even quicker with a jazz blues. A jazz blues might have the 1 chord for a measure, the 4 chord for a measure. That's not any different from our quick change blues. The 1 chord for a measure. But then in measure 4, it's very common to do a 2/5 to lead to the 4 chord. That's very music theory intensive lingo right there. But I'll just tell you what chords to play if you're not understanding what I meant by a 2/5 leading to the 4 chord. Don't worry, let's just learn the chords themselves. We could do a G minor chord, a C7 chord, leading to an F7 chord. Or you could do a G minor 7th chord, which would be 0, 2, 1, 1, a little bar there to get that. That's a beautiful chord. That's what a lot of people would call a, quote, jazz chord, a G minor 7. It is kind of jazzy. So it's all in the 4th measure. So we had C7 for 1. Here comes F7 for the 2nd measure. C7 for the 3rd measure, but then G minor, C7, and that leads to measure 5, which is an F7 chord. A lot of jazz people like to throw in a diminished chord there, an F sharp diminished for the 6th bar. And then they do something kind of cool for the 7th and 8th bars. Instead of just sitting on C7 for 2 as we were before, you might do a C7 dropping down to a B flat 7 and finally an A7. And actually you can throw a B7 in there too, so like C7, B7, B flat 7, A7. That's real common. The song Crazy by Willie Nelson that Patsy Cline made so famous, that does that kind of little trick too. It's nice. 4 chords in the place of 1. Here's what I did. I did a bar chord C7. Don't worry if you cannot do bar chords yet. You can just play an easy C7 during this part. But what I did for those of you that are up for your bar chords, it was 3, 4, 3, 3. A 3rd fret bar, dropping down to a 2nd fret bar, which is a B7 chord, dropping down to a 1st fret bar, which is a B flat 7 chord, and a chord that all of us could do, beginner, intermediate, advanced, doesn't matter. Everyone can do an A7 chord, which is 0, 1, 0, 0. So for those who are a little bit intimidated by this, you know, one thing you could do is just go, you could do C7 to A7. That's very doable for a player at any level. All right, so that gives you a jazzier sound. And then finally, instead of just sitting there on the 5 chord or sitting there on the 5 chord going to the 4 chord, we're going to do something called a 2/5, which I've talked about in Essential Chord Progression series previous to this, but in case you didn't catch it, we're doing the 2nd chord of the key, which is D minor, or if you want to be even jazzier, D minor 7, 2, 2, 1, 3, beautiful little chord, and then G7, all of you know G7, and that leads to C. So let's hear that 2, 5, 1 in context. 2, 5, 1. It would be a little boring just to sit on 1 for that whole time at the end for bars 11 and 12. So that's when I throw in this. I go C7, E flat 7, D7, D flat 7. A little chromatic thing there. 1 fret at a time, a half step at a time. C7 being, as we played it earlier, 3, 4, 3, 3. Slide that way on up to the 6th fret and you get 6, 7, 6, 6. It's an E flat 7 chord. Go to a D7 chord, which is 5, 6, 5, 5. go to a D flat 7 chord, which is 4, 5, 4, 4, and then you're home free. You just hit a C7 chord. So here's that whole last 4 bars of a jazz version of blues, a jazzier blues. So that's kind of cool. That gives you way more chords. It's always moving. There's all this chromatic motion and stuff that makes it a little more interesting. So let's try our jazz blues together before we wrap this up. Next time, look out for minor blues. We're going to talk about songs like The Thrill Is Gone and Cold, Cold Feeling by Albert Collins and some of these great, Since I've Been Loving You by Led Zeppelin, great, great minor blues songs. All right, here we go to take it out. Let's do a few rounds of our jazzy blues in C. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. One more time. Alright, fellow ukuleleans, glad you enjoyed that, and thanks for playing the blues with me. I, of course, will link down below 2 tabs so that you can learn all of these chords. I'm not going to leave you high and dry and make you Google this stuff. I will provide you with a chart that will show you this 12-bar blues as a quick change, as a jazz blues, and all the chord diagrams you need to get by. Alright, fellow ukuleleans, you take care. Bye-bye.